Hi, I'm Chris from airwindows, and I got a bit of a blast from the past today. This is called StereoFX. It's VST for the first time, Linux, Windows, etc. But it was a aggressive, early, um, inspired by another plugin that was out there, because I did that back in the early days, plugin that has a few extra qualities going on with it as well. And it has a stereo wide, a bass mono maker, which is a sort of moving shelf in that it'll go up in frequency as you turn it up, and a thing called center squish. Here's how StereoFX works. It goes into a mid-side calculation where the width is separate from the general body of the sound. And stereo wide is capable of throwing the high impact filter on width. That's got a very aggressive effect. It really throws a lot of crazy artifacts and stuff on there. Mono bass is a handy little utility, which is, I've got other stuff that does that. This is the original version, where it'll bring the bass into the center. And center squish does something entirely different. What center squish does is it brings in a clipping effect that, rather than boosting things like, say, in channel 4, 5, etc., the boost tends to make things louder because it's gain compensated to do so. In StereoFX, center squish throws the clipping on. It's the smoothest clipping you can have without any volume accentuation. So what it's doing is just limiting the peaks in the center without limiting the peaks on the side. And I'll show you what each of those things sounds like. Here is pictures. I'll turn it down a bit. You can hear there's guitars on the sides. And now you can hear the guitars are much louder. Oh, but they can be even louder still. It gets kind of aggressive though. So there's going to be a sweet spot in here, probably fairly early on, but it's designed to be able to cope with things at various volume levels. I'll try that again. Listen to the stuff on the sides. As you can hear, that got a lot louder. Now for mono bass, I've got a very handy little thing. People used to hear a lot of this. I do have new music, I just haven't edited it together and started using it for things yet, but I'm using the modular stuff to make new music, and that's showing up on the airwindows YouTube channel, although it doesn't get announced in forums or anything, because there's no forum that I'm aware of that is for that stuff. But, well, now, muffwiggler.com, that's for that stuff, but still not for just posting people's random jams. Here's a good old Alien Kittens. I can monoize the bass like this. And it's actually caused a little bit of a boost here. More. That drone noise, when I start to reach its frequency, everything goes into the center. And then back to stereo. Now this is a fairly decent option for demonstrating center squish. It's a little harder to hear. It's a subtle effect. When you put a sine wave based or a sine function based clipping on something, using it at low degrees of saturation is very hard to hear. And if you're applying it to this mid channel, it can become even harder to hear, but I'm pretty sure I can dial it in such a way that it'll become fairly obvious. Let's find out. We've got a volume level of about 0.3, but if I hit center squish all the way, it's taken a little out of there. It's taken about a dB off. And yeah, that will contribute to wideness because I'm not also clipping, or I'm not also saturating the side channel. The side channel is left alone, and the center channel has this very, very subtle little saturation going on. Let's try it back on empty pictures. That has a lot of bass and a lot of center content. Minus 2.5 or thereabouts. And minus 3.1 or thereabouts. So that's whereas stereo wide starts out as a very obvious effect if you push it. Center squish always stays as a very subtle effect, but it will help you get the spatiality. It'll set the center back, and then you can use an even smaller amount of stereo wide to bring the sides forward. So what we're going to do is, there were some guitars on empty pictures on the very sides, so we'll fire that up, we'll throw the center squish on, and then we'll start bringing the guitars up with stereo wide and switch it back in, switch it in and out a little bit, see what we get. Switched. So I can hear a louder guitar over here. And then off. And then wide. That's StereoFX for you. It's a bit of an oldie but goodie. What I ended up doing was replacing it with wide, because wide is much more well-behaved in terms of like mastering duties or something. You can really shape the envelope in subtler and more coherent ways. StereoFX is not subtle or coherent. I mean, center squish is subtle. If you wanted to just only use that, that's super subtle. But the stereo wide thing is based on high impact, and it's aggressive. It's a harsh and weird maximizer. Mono bass brings a lot of bass heaviness and boost going on, and the whole thing is not for your classical music pieces necessarily. But if this is the kind of thing, if you like throwing a little exaggerated stereo stuff going on, it may very well still find use for you. And so I have brought it out as a VST and an audio unit and a Linux VST in two different forms of Windows VST, 32-bit and 64-bit, and three different forms of audio unit, and I think also Mac VST. It's 32-bit, 64-bit, and PowerPC, because I still compile stuff for PowerPC. Because what if you had a PowerPC computer that was useful to use for music somehow? It's not like my plugins are going to bog them down terribly much. So it's bringing, things that people consider to be not worth anything and making them be useful. And I really like that. That's also why I liked turning into Patreon so much. I was selling plugins for $50 a pop, and that's fair. The quality of these plugins is such that that's fair. But when I went over to the Patreon, it gave me the opportunity to just give all the plugins away. And all I ask is, if you are using my stuff, you can download the new updates. Technically, it's all of the updates from when I began starting to do VSTs, and all of them include the Linux ones, by the way. You can download that. I've updated the files so that the plugins are contained within little subfolders, and that means rather than having to open up all the little bundles, if you ever tried this when I was doing that, I can see why people wouldn't necessarily be trying to install everything, because that's a lot of work. So I did it for you. And you can go into one of the folders like Mac AU or Windows 32, select all of the plugins and drag them to your plugin place, and install them all at once. Because maybe you want to install 100 amazing plugins. Why not? And if you have installed your 100 amazing plugins and you're using them to your heart's content and find even one that you would have bought at $50 if it had been for sale and only for sale at $50, you can join my Patreon and kick in at a level of $50 a year. I've done the math for you so you can know what you would have to pledge per month in order to go add $50 a year, or $100 a year if you would have bought 2, or $150 a year if you would have bought 3 this year. Wait till next year, maybe I'll have another 3 that you would have bought. And doing that kind of stuff helps me work with all of these things that give me a lot of joy, and I'm very excited about them. And when I do that, I tell you how I do these things, and that means you can try them as well. It's a living. It's a strange internet-based living that one would not believe if one was born in 1968 like me and grew up in an era where all of this wasn't possible. But hey, now all of this is possible, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to bring it to people so that you can have all the tools you want and nobody's going to take them away from you. Now that's a motivating factor. So thank you very much for your attention and for using all these plugins like crazy and telling people about this strange guy out in Vermont that's doing this crazy stuff. And I will talk to you later. Thank you very much.